Hi there and welcome to part 2 of my podcast, What is Enculturation and Why Does It Matter? In the first part of this podcast, I spoke about what enculturation is, and it is my aim to speak mainly in this second part about why it matters, but I'm going to briefly recap as regards what enculturation is. And the definition that I used in the last one was enculturation, whether conscious or unconscious, is about attunement to the prevalent social norms, whether on a macro or micro level, the purpose of which is to make oneself and others acceptable citizens. And on a personal level, a person's own enculturation is designed to enhance their survival. Enculturation is one of the oldest, most primal and ubiquitous human behaviours. It's both a macro and micro process. The family unit functions like a little mini society. Enculturation doesn't necessarily occur as a result of personal growth. In fact, where children are concerned, it doesn't. So I'm now going to briefly run through some examples both on a small and larger scale. What's interesting about this subject is that it's huge. It's very much backdrop in our society. So much so that you could actually argue that sort of both sides of the political spectrum are both the result of enculturation. Racism is the form of enculturation. Its opposite, anti-racism, is the result of enculturation. Political ideologies, both conservative and liberal leftist ideologies, are both the result of enculturation. Remember that enculturation happens on both a large and small level. It can happen within the context of wider society through the use of things like media and the internet, or it can happen on a smaller level within families, peer groups, and at school. So I'm now going to include a few other examples. Some of these are relatively small ones, but they will help to deepen your understanding of this topic. One small example could be wearing clothes you previously wouldn't have been seen dead in because they're now fashionable. This very common thing. Another, and this is particularly relevant at this point in human history, is supporting out of the blue causes you previously didn't care about or weren't aware of just because society, i.e. media, education or internet tells you should care about it. And declaring yourself as belonging to a particular group because you've unconsciously observed certain fringe benefits to being a part of that group, i.e. a sense of belonging, a sense of community, protection, or because you've unconsciously observed some other benefit to belonging to it, i.e. its large or well-known group. Another would be adopting a particular cultural behaviour or practice simply because of how widespread it is rather than because of the personal meaning or value it has to you. An example of this would be non-Christians celebrating Christmas. Another example would be inconsistency, i.e. we should protect the feelings of some groups and people whilst others are fair game. This applies right through the political spectrum just because quote-unquote society says. An example of this would be that things such as racism and sexism are now being openly challenged in society, whereas something like ageism, I would say, is deeply, deeply ingrained into our society and is almost backdrop, and it applies both equally to the very young, i.e. very young children, and the very old. And finally, another example of enculturation is adopting your family's beliefs and values without question. Of course, I'm not suggesting that everybody takes on the beliefs and values of the family into which they're born. There are many who challenge that, but the risk there, of course, is that you can actually kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and you can become quite reactionary and go in the extreme opposite end to your family's beliefs and values. That's a thing as well, and it's highly reactionary. Now I'm going to move on from talking about what enculturation is and giving you a recap of the first podcast. I'm going to now talk about other aspects of this, such as why it matters, and I'm also going to cover negative aspects of enculturation on both the left and right of the political spectrum, because let's face it, where the subject matter of my podcast is concerned, politics very much comes into that. And what I'm going to try and do here is take a sort of outsider observer view of some of these issues from a sort of outside perspective and give a kind of holistic view of how enculturation affects both sides of the political spectrum. So we'll start with the left of the political spectrum, liberalism, and here are some of the negative aspects of that. The formation of echo chambers and groupthink which limits critical thinking and leads to a lack of open dialogue with those holding different views. Mobbing and cancel culture, obviously highly toxic behaviours, creating a sense of belonging amongst individuals, so people engage in mobbing and cancel culture because it gives them a shared sense of belonging. Intolerance towards those holding different views, obviously that can apply to both sides of the political spectrum. Identity politics, i.e. categorisation of people based on demographic characteristics. Confirmation bias, that's a huge one. Virtue signalling, aligning with quote-unquote progressive values without substantive action, or taking some perceived social reward for having those values. The demonisation of opponents without any engagement, and divisive and polarising rhetoric. Stereotyping and inflexibility. Next, we'll move on to the negative aspects of enculturation on the right of the political spectrum. And at this point, I'm going to point out that in my lifetime, I would say that I've had both liberal and conservative views, and I would say that at current, my overall views contain a few aspects of both without being attached to either. So the negative aspects of enculturation on the right of the political spectrum, resistance to change is probably number one on the list. I've spoken to many individuals with conservative beliefs and those on the so-called alt-right, and it's almost ubiquitous amongst them that there is a huge resistance to change. It's one of their defining characteristics. Suspicion of or rejection of differences, so that which is radically different and outside their comfort zone, there tends to be a knee-jerk reaction of suspicion and or rejection of that difference. Tribalism, unconscious tribalism, that equally applies to the left of the political spectrum as well. Stereotyping, again, that applies to the left and right. And lack of empathy towards genuinely mistreated groups. A good example of this, very relevant because it's what I normally talk about, is many, if not most conservatives, on the rare occasions that you hear them speaking about intersex people, will quite commonly defend the surgeries which are carried out on intersex people. Some conservatives will condemn the idea of carrying out those surgeries non-consensually, some won't, and some will defend those surgeries but say that it would be better if they were carried out with the person's consent. So I'm not going to say that all conservatives defend intersex genital mutilation, but what I will say is that some do, and some defend it as long as the person is involved in the process, and think that the sort of normalisation of intersex people is a necessary thing. And finally, the last negative aspect of enculturation on the right of the political spectrum, inflexibility and rigid thought patterns, but again that equally applies to those on the left of the political spectrum. So I'm now going to move on from that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why enculturation matters, and it'll become clear as we go along why I've just covered the two sides of the political spectrum. So the first thing that I would like to say as regards why enculturation matters, it applies to the non-consensual surgeries which are still being forced upon intersex people all over the world, mostly when they're children and sometimes when they're even just babies. I would say, based on everything that I've said in these last two podcasts so far, I would argue that the non-consensual surgeries which are carried out on intersex people are an example of forced enculturation. So when it comes to widespread ideas regarding what a person's body should look like, I would say that quite broad brushstrokes have been painted as regards a person's genitalia, and people have this very stereotyped view of what men and women should look like, and because intersex people don't fit neatly into that, these surgeries are forced upon them. Therefore, I am arguing that it is forced enculturation. In response to that, as I've just been talking about, on the right of the political spectrum amongst conservatives, you've got widespread apathy and or indifference to this issue. However, what I particularly want to talk about as regards enculturation is the way that the left of the political spectrum view this. So I think it's fair to say that over the last 20 years or so, leftist ideologies have very much focused on the subject of sex and gender. So you would suppose that a lot of that emphasis has been placed on the fact that intersex genital mutilation is still a thing even in the 21st century. But you would be entirely wrong, and this is where the topic of enculturation comes in. I would say that there is a certain hypocrisy in promoting so-called equality for some groups whilst ignoring far more serious human rights abuses in other groups, i.e. intersex people. Leftists in the 21st century aren't actually about genuine growth. I would say that it's about society says. It's a form of enculturation. So we have a media now and a culture and a society and an establishment and an education system and an internet, all of which are promoting the idea of inclusion and are promoting the idea of diversity and gender expression and all of this stuff. And obviously you can't fail to have noticed that there are businesses all over the land that are putting up these little notices saying everyone's welcome here. But what I'm trying to essentially argue here is that this is empty enculturation and that it's only skin deep. It's about society says. It's a script and it has parameters. It's not about addressing genuine human rights issues. If you do a sort of appraisal of this, large emphasis is being placed on issues such as pronouns, i.e. controlling the words that come out of human beings' mouths, whereas in our society virtually no emphasis is being placed on intersex genital mutilation, or for that matter the genital mutilation of non-intersex men and women. So we never hear anything about circumcision, we never hear very much about female genital mutilation, and we almost never hear anything about intersex genital mutilation, but we're being told that it's a human rights issue what pronouns you use in reference to another human being. I'll just say explicitly outright that I consider intersex genital mutilation, I consider the non-consensual surgeries being forced upon intersex children still all over the world in the 21st century to be a more important issue than, for example, what pronouns a person uses. I'll explicitly state it. I consider that to be more important. So in that sense, I have no problem with hierarchies. If it's about dismantling existing power structures and hierarchies which have disadvantaged a lot of groups throughout history, then that's fine. So next up, I want to talk a little bit more about this so-called woke subculture which has sprung up in the 21st century in the Western world, because I think it's a fantastic example of enculturation, and I think it's a fantastic example of the limitations of enculturation, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, and I'm going to use a particular example. So I briefly just mentioned this idea of everyone welcome here. There are a lot of businesses in the 21st century in the Western world. I don't know if it's going on elsewhere in the Western world, but it's certainly very common now in the UK to see these little notices in the windows of businesses claiming that everybody is welcome here. Now, there are a number of ways in which I can address this. There's lots of angles that you could take with this. Firstly, we're talking about capitalist businesses here, so the idea that there would be anybody that would be unwelcome is fairly laughable. The purpose of businesses in the Western world in the 21st century is to make money, and they don't particularly care, nor are they particularly choosy about who they're making money from. So the idea that anybody would be unwelcome in any major capitalist business in the Western world in the 21st century is probably not very accurate. So secondly, what I want to say is, by no stretch of the imagination do I personally consider that businesses in the Western world, we're talking about multi-million or multi-billion pound businesses here, by no stretch of the imagination do I believe that those businesses care about equality or diversity or promoting equality or diversity or care about human rights or any oppressed or marginalised groups of people. I've spoken about this kind of thing before when we have Western governments virtue signalling and pretending to care about oppressed or marginalised groups. I don't believe a bit of it, and I don't believe that multi-million or billion-pound companies in the Western world care about this issue either. This is a fantastic example of enculturation. It's businesses unconsciously or consciously attuning to a widespread cultural norm. They are doing so because things like cancel culture exist. So we know now that there are people who can have a serious impact on businesses or individuals if they do not say or do the right things. We all know that's a thing, and I don't believe that this Everybody Welcome Here movement, if you want to call it that, is the result of actual genuine, authentic personal growth. It would be silly to suggest such a thing. We're talking about businesses here. Their modus operandi is to make money, not promote equality and diversity and inclusion. Some of these businesses include banks, by the way. Again, an example of a business which are primarily and in fact only concerned with money and making money. So the idea, I'm not sure how many people are buying into this, but the idea that a multi-billion-pound bank cares about oppressed groups in society is, again, laughable and lamentable. Again, I don't know how much people are buying into this, but you have to be able to look at this objectively from a kind of outside observer perspective and see this for the ridiculous nonsense that it is. So what I'm arguing is that the Everyone Welcome Here movement is essentially performative. It is scripted, contrived and artificial, even in some cases robotic. And this so-called woke subculture, which I'm talking about, is inauthentic because it forces individuals and businesses to banish prejudice rather than integrate it. It doesn't facilitate actual personal growth because it forces people to suppress, deny and disown their prejudice rather than take responsibility for it and have compassion for themselves as regards why they're prejudiced in the first place, i.e. racism is made, it's not born. If you hear a little 7-year-old kid spouting racist epithets, the very last thing that you should do is shame that child. The first thing that you need to do is calmly, peacefully, and in a non-shaming way explain to that child the implications of what they're saying and then get to the root cause of where it came from, and I guarantee it's somebody older in that child's life. Racism does not exist in a vacuum. Nobody wakes up one day in adulthood and decides to be racist. The approach that leftists are taking towards this issue is largely centred around the idea of suppression, and that is not going to work, not in the long-term bigger picture. Recognising one's own prejudices is like a form of shadow work. It has to be done with compassion, and this is where leftist politics falls down, because many leftists are actually collapsed conservatives who have suppressed, denied and disowned and demonised their own prejudices, therefore unable to feel compassion towards people who still hold prejudicial views. A more common response is hate, and responding to hate with hate creates, unsurprisingly, more hate. So finally, I'm going to end this podcast by giving you an example of what it is I'm talking about, and I hope it will make crystal clear exactly what it is I'm talking about. I found it on a website called the Everyone Welcome Initiative, which you can find at everyonewelcomeinitiative.com. It's another fine example of enculturation which doesn't go beyond a very surface level and has not occurred as a result of true growth. This has all sprung up over the last 20 years, and it's the result of enculturation, and enculturation does not happen as a result of shadow work and true deep diving. It doesn't. So I'm now going to read out something to you which is taken from the website of this Everyone Welcome Initiative. The aim of this initiative is to provide beer venues and events with a strong statement that everyone who walks through the door is welcome regardless of their gender, sexual orientation, race, health, religion, age or disability. Whilst these forms of discrimination are covered under the Equality Act, none of us can say that they don't happen, and what this initiative is designed to do is give people the opportunity to nail their colours to the mast about the kind of venue or event they are running, to shout proudly that hate isn't to be tolerated and ignorance is not an excuse. So I'm going to first of all address this last sentence. Hate isn't to be tolerated, ignorance is not an excuse. Ignorance is an excuse. If a person does not know something, then they don't know something. This is what I am trying to desperately explain here. You cannot make a racist into a non-racist just by shaming them and telling them to stop doing what they are doing. Ignorance is an excuse. If somebody has not yet reached a point in their personal development of feeling accepting towards various different groups in society, then that is the point that they are at, and they can only be brought to a further point in their own personal development through self-compassion, not through mobs shaming them. Secondly, hate is an emotion, and whilst it is a very destructive and volatile emotion like jealousy, once again you can't suppress, deny and disown it out of existence. People who are experiencing hatred towards others or different groups in society will absolutely be required to exercise compassion towards themselves in an effort to dissolve that hatred. No other method will suffice. It's an emotion. You can't suppress, deny and disown it out of existence. I realise that this will sound fairly radical to a lot of people, but I like radical. And by the way, that doesn't mean excusing or defending hatred. It means integrating it. Upon doing so, one usually finds that the traits and characteristics that they are attributing to their hate target are usually present within themselves. It then goes on to say, this isn't PC gone mad, virtue signalling or anything else that people are bound to throw at this initiative. I have no idea if it's PC gone mad, but it's definitely virtue signalling and it's enculturation. And this is the particularly laughable part. It says, all the Everyone Welcome initiative hopes to be is an aid to the growth of diversity in the beer world and hopefully in time the wider hospitality trade. No, all the Everyone Welcome initiative hope to do is continue to get the profits rolling in and are quite happy to pander to any trend which comes along in order to do so. We're talking about capitalist business interests. Anybody who believes that the beer industry gives a crap about equality, diversity, inclusion or anything else like that, well, I have some wonderful seafront property in Switzerland which you may be interested in buying. This piece of writing then goes on to say, later on, because I'm not reading it all out, it then goes on to say, this event/venue will exclude people who discriminate against anyone in the event/venue on any grounds. So obviously there's a contradiction there. They're arguing against discrimination but are also simultaneously promoting the idea of ejecting somebody from the venue based on their beliefs. This isn't the way of doing things. This isn't the way of actually fostering tolerance in our society. This is not how you go about doing it. It won't work. It will have the opposite effect. So to conclude, the argument that I've been making in this podcast is that many forms of enculturation are not necessarily the result of actual personal or collective growth. They tend to be, in many instances, fairly shallow forms of behaviour which are occurring because people perceive that there is some reward for carrying out that particular form of behaviour. Enculturation also tends to be largely unconscious and is driven by factors which are often not visible to people. An example of this would be when people get the message from the mainstream media that they should care about a particular issue when there are actually issues going on in the world, such as intersex genital mutilation, which are far more serious issues. This proves that enculturation is a largely shallow process and doesn't necessarily have any intrinsic value or meaning in and of itself. It's essentially a survival mechanism and it yields rewards, but some of us have experienced the negative effects of it and are also in a position to observe it from an outside perspective. And that is what I have endeavoured to do in this podcast. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this, or at the very least got something from it, or have found it useful in some way. If you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to my podcast and please tune in again in the future. Thank you for listening.